Ready for me to tell you something you've never heard before? Thomas movies are extremely mixed. Almost every year before 2018, there was a new movie released, and the movie was either considered the best content to ever come out of the series, or be one of the series' biggest federal crimes. But which ones fit in either categories? That of which will be determined. So, considering this video will probably be very long, here is every Thomas movie ranked worst to best, in my opinion. To have a movie work, what components would you need? Most people would ideally think to have a well-written story, good characters, and intriguing moments to keep the viewer watching. Now, what would happen if you took away those elements? Well, you end up getting the equivalent of being mentally tortured. Mission Rescue is everything a Thomas movie shouldn't be. Make that movies in general. Every time I watch this movie, all I can think to myself is, why is Thomas extremely unlikable? Why are the logging locals the epitome of my existence? Who is running this dystopian to road? Why is your top man an idiot? Why would they send Thomas to the mainland on a raft? How hasn't the Shake Shake Bridge collapsed yet? And those aren't even all my complaints with this movie. At this point, I'm just wasting my time talking about this movie. Everyone and their grandma knows this movie sucks, so I'll just leave it at here and move on from this mistake. Number 13, Big World Big Adventures, aka Wubba. Wubba has to be one of the most forgettable and boring pieces of Thomas media I've ever watched. Even when a big event happens in this movie, it's usually one of the goofiest things I've ever seen come out of this franchise, which makes it as worse as it was already boring. Not to mention how much of an eyesore it is to look at this movie. I mean, how on earth did we go from this to this in the span of only 3 years? Overall, this was a terrible way to not only wrap up the annual movies, but also to begin the rebrand. Number 12, Day of the Diesels. Now, a lot of people would rank Bubba over Day of the Diesels, and for granted, their reasons are valid. But if there's one thing Day of the Diesels has that Bubba doesn't, is an effort. From what we know of Day of the Diesel's early development, the writers wanted the movie to go for a darker tone, but of course, Hit Entertainment shut a lot of these ideas down. This in turn made the movie pretty bad, having a lot of issues like a confusing plot, super slow pacing, and its biggest offender in my opinion, the characters. Percy is portrayed as being a gullible idiot, Diesel 10 has an insanely confusing plan, and almost all the new characters feel like cash grabs, but that's not anything new. Day of the Diesels had a decent amount of potential in my eyes, but the movie didn't live up to it as much as I wish it did. Speaking of wasted potential, next we have Calling All Engines. Just to get it out of the way, this movie's pacing is beyond terrible, and that is thanks to two main reasons: unnecessary scenes and learning segments. Listen, I get this movie was made for like toddlers, but I bet that even they would become bored with this movie. Now, despite the obvious flaws, this movie actually has a decent amount of good things in it, like Thomas, who was used pretty well here, putting him in a bad spotlight, being the main reason for both the Steamies and Diesel's conflict, and at the incompletion of the Soto Airport. And sure, they've done that same premise in later movies which were way better than this one, but hey, gotta give credit to Calling All Engines for doing it first. Also, the moral of this movie is, sure, a little generic, but it's actually decently expanded upon here, and all I need to do to prove that is with this single clip.
Thomas finally puffed into the coaling plant. He blew his whistle, and all of the engines went quiet. Steamies and Diesels need to work together, chuffed Thomas. We don't want to work with stinky Steamies, oiled Diesel. We don't want to work with dirty Diesels either, huffed James. If the airport doesn't open, it will be bad for all the engines, puffed Thomas. Both steam engines and diesel engines need passengers and freight to be useful. All of the engines agreed. They knew that Thomas was right, and they all wanted the airport to open.
I know it's only one scene, but Thomas makes a very valid point here. In a way, he makes the mural feel so much more complex in my opinion, especially for the Hit era. This is the first movie on the list I wouldn't consider bad, but it's still pretty mid with its other problems in mind. Number 10. Thomas and the Magic Railroad. This movie could get an entire video with how much there is to say with this movie, but I'll try and keep it short. This movie is made up of not one, not two, but 4 plot lines. The first one's about Diesel 10 wanting to destroy the magic buffers. The second one is about Mr. Conductor trying to regain his gold dust. The third one is about Burnett Stone trying to bring Lady back to steam. And the last one is about Lily trying to get back to Muffle Mountain. Do you notice something about these 4? Yeah, only one of them is related to Thomas. You know, the character on the title. At that point, this movie should have just been advertised as a Shining Time Station movie. Anyways, going back to the actual movie, it's very mixed. On one end, the Soda scenes are absolutely fantastic. Down to the model work, the characters, it's all just done so well. But on the other hand, there's the human scenes, which have probably some of the most bizarre and hard to follow moments of this entire movie, and they make this movie really convoluted. Like I said before, there's so much more things to talk about with this movie, but then this video would be 40 to 50 minutes long. So to cap it off, this movie is going right in between the rankings for both its good and bad moments. Number 9. The Great Race. This entire movie feels like an advertisement, with most of the new things added feeling barely relevant. Take example, The Great Railway Show, which is only seen for like 10 to 50 minutes of the film, which is, by the way, the main selling point of the movie. There's also the new characters introduced in this movie, which don't do anything besides be there for merchandise. The only important new characters are Ashima and I guess Vinny, but that's only 2 out of the 12 characters besides the Flying Scotsman introduced. And the ironic part is, they barely made any new merchandise of these characters when the movie came out. Not to mention all of the other big parts of this movie, which were also turned into merchandise. Also, a lot of plotlines of this movie felt extremely useless, especially the Diesel plot, where it's literally just there for comic relief. And merchandise. The only other parts of this movie I like is how Gordon is used, the moral, and the Flying Scotsman coming back, even though his basis is based on the wrong type. Other than that, the movie's just alright. Not mid, not bad, just alright. Number 8. Journey Beyond Sodor. There are quite a few things I like about this movie, like the steampunk theme, the story, and the best part in my opinion, the characters. When it comes to new characters, I'm not the biggest fan of most of them, especially you, but I will say, Frankie and Hurricane, the new villains in this movie, are actually pretty good, being written as manipulative and controlling, although Frankie fits that description a bit more than Hurricane, so... When it comes to Sodor characters you've already seen before, James couldn't not be mentioned. Here he's written super well here, and in my opinion might be one of his best CGI portrayals yet, but this movie's ranked lower for a reason. The ending of the movie feels extremely forced, the movie is the first to have the bouncing, and it continues the trend of having unrealistic moments. But other than that, this is the first movie on the list I'd consider pretty good, and thankfully ends the trend of mediocre movies. Number 7. King of the Railway. This has to be one of the most underrated Thomas movies in my opinion. For one thing, the new characters in this movie are actually really good, especially Steven. He carries this movie. And speaking of Steven, we get to hear about his backstory, which is also really interesting, with it being based on not only the real engine, but it also expands upon the realism of the series. What this movie also expands upon is the series lore, with Halstead Castle, King Godred, as well as his crown. The only part of this movie I don't like is some of the pacing, because honestly, there's a lot of parts in this movie where it doesn't really feel like much is happening, and it can be a bit boring at points. I feel the main purpose of this movie is to world build, and it does it really well. Overall, a great way to start off the Brenner era. Number 6. Hero of the Rails. Hero of the Rails was the first full CGI Thomas movie / project, not counting season 12, and with this new movie came new ideas. For starters, this movie introduced a new location, called the Steamworks, and would go on to be a staple area for the rest of the series. Honestly, the Steamworks might be one of my favorite places introduced to the island. Not only is it a spectacle to look at, but the new characters who live there too are also great. Speaking of characters, this movie's greatest strength was how well done the new characters were written. A lot of the new / major characters introduced in this movie I've already talked about in the top 10 favorite characters video, but I'll try and keep it brief. Victor was a pretty good character in his introduction, had a lot of charm to him, for sure, but I'd still say his character was honestly done way better in Blue Mountain Mystery, which we'll talk about later. Kevin is Kevin. Spencer being the antagonist is a really unique idea, even if his motives are questionable, and Hero's backstory, character, and moments make him the best character of this movie. For the movie that kickstarted the CGI series, it's a really good movie. It just sucks the era following didn't live up to this movie. Number 5. Tale of the Brave. This movie is very character focused in retrospect, but it's the better for it, and in turn gives us some great character portrayals. This movie feels like what Day of the Diesels was trying to do, but failed, because this movie might have one of Percy's best CGI portrayals in the entire series. Most notably, his story arc, which is fantastic, having to overcome being afraid of things like the dark and monsters, which he of course in the end overcomes. Besides characters we know, there are a lot of great characters introduced in this movie, but Gator has to be the best character introduced, and ironically enough, he is the most least used character after this movie. Gator is used like a mentor for Percy, where when Percy tells/shows to him his problems, he's able to give him advice on how to overcome it, and he's able to do this because he can relate to him, which is the sole reason why their friendship works so well in this movie. Another thing done well here was the way they handled Thomas and Percy's friendship. In most other forms of media, they're more so just portrayed as best friends who can never be separated, but here, it's the opposite, and I really like them for doing that. It made their friendship here feel so much more real and on edge. What I feel this movie tries to do is to take old ideas that have been done in the past and do/improve upon them way better. Because of that, this movie was really good, and it 100% deserves to start off the top 5. Number 4. The Adventure Begins. This movie is done both more accurate than Season 1, but also really different from Season 1. When it comes to accuracy and continuity and plot, it's a perfect recreation. It adapts the books in order while at the same time having old and new elements to make it different, like the nighttime scenes. However, some of these elements are way too drastic, mainly the characters, specifically Thomas and Henry. If we look back at the Railway series and Model series, Thomas is at first cocky, rude, impatient, etc., but later develops and changes, while Henry was also rude and impatient, but was also a lot more sympathetic and still useful. But in The Adventure Begins, however, Thomas is nice from the start with only having some moments of cheekiness, and Henry is portrayed as a big wimp. Now, neither of these things are new, we've seen both portrayed like this before. But we need to remember here that the main point of this movie was to adapt the first few Railway series stories into one movie, while at the same time still being different. Honestly though, that could be just a nitpick, because this movie's positives really overshadowed the negatives by a long shot. Thomas and James in their original liveries, Edward being in character for once, the soundtrack using tracks from the classic era, using the same Railway series dialogue. It's insane how much cool little details they added. Overall, a phenomenal way to celebrate Thomas' 70th anniversary. Number 3. Blue Mountain Mystery. 4 years before this point, the Narrow Gauge Engines after Season 5 took a huge change in character, and for the absolute worst. Now they were just portrayed as being both extremely youthful and terrible to each other. Until 2012 came around when we were blessed with this movie, and the Narrow Gauge Engines were finally back to their former glory again. This movie does everything right here. The characters are fantastic here, as well as the new ones. Most of them are sort of just okay, but they're still pretty enjoyable. But the best one out of all of them in my opinion is 100% Luke. I've also already talked about Luke in the top 10 character video, so this will also be brief. Every aspect of Luke in this movie is fantastic. His backstory is really interesting and dark. I like how mysterious they make him feel at the start, and his connection between him and Victor was really unexpected. Speaking of Victor, this movie has, without doubt, the best portrayal of Victor yet. Taking a character as random as Victor and giving him a really deep backstory worked so well here. It also gave a reason for why he had a Spanish accent. I'd also be inclined to mention the Narrow Gauge Engines. Every single one here is perfect. They now feel so much more mature like they used to be. The fact we had this great of writing in an era like the Sharon Miller era is a miracle. This was the last big project by Nitrogen, but it was a fantastic way to go out. Easily top 3 material. Number 2 is nothing. Now, you're probably confused. What do I mean when I say nothing? Well, the thing is, the 2 movies left to rank are both going in number 1. That's right, I just pulled an unlucky tongue. What are you gonna do about it? In all seriousness though, these 2 movies were really hard to rank considering how fantastic both are. But, in my defense, if you look back at both movies, they have a lot of similar elements. Don't believe me? Well, Thomas in the first half of the movie is cheeky and rude, while at the same time he meets a new tank engine, of which he is jealous of. So, to get payback, he tricks them. While on the topic of characters, the movie also introduces new and old characters we haven't seen in a long time, with most of them being Jack in the Pack characters. There's also a lot of catchy songs throughout the film, and Thomas discovers something that was once considered lost forever. See what I mean? Now, I'm not saying the movies are the exact same, both have a lot of elements that make them different in their own ways. Soul's Edge and Lost Treasure has some fantastic storytelling, the darker tone is used phenomenally, the returning characters were extremely unexpected but really cool to see, Sailor John is a great villain, the characters are used great, especially Thomas, the CGI is incredible, and it's overall one of the best pieces of Thomas media out there in my opinion. Same case with The Great Discovery. Great storytelling, very underrated narrating by Pierce Brosnan. The model work is some of the best we've seen in the entire series, the songs are also really catchy, the return of Jack in the Pack was really nice to see, and Great Waterton is a really interesting location, which really expands upon the lore. All of that, despite it being a lot, goes to show that, despite the similarities, both can be great in a lot of ways, and because of these reasons are why they are here at the number 1